All right, you're currently in South Africa to give the inaugural Albert Luthuli Memorial Lecture. Now, he's one of South Africa's greatest leaders, the first South African to receive a Nobel Prize.
Well,
Lots of values.
Really for the whole continent. His leadership in the middle 50s to the 60s, which kind of predates Nkrumah and Ghana, as he paved the way. And then after this crisis, he was illuminated with his Nobel Prize. 34 countries became independent in the next 3 years. So he was in the middle of that whole fundamental change. And while some leaders were imprisoned on Robben Island, some were exiled, he stayed here and was banned. He fought from within and did in such a magnificent job. He set a vision of a new reconciling white and black Africa as opposed to a warfare South Africa. And so we honor his legacy because his work ethic and his sense of morality and his vision is needed today.
From those values of being somebody who is a uniting force, a person who speaks about non-racialism and reconciliation, those are values we can espouse today. Do you think we've embraced them in modern-day Africa?
In a real sense, you know, given the apartheid oppression, how mean that system was, if there had been a spirit of retaliation, you'd have had a bloodbath in South Africa. But the thrust here was coexistence over co-annihilation. And you've had, with that sense of truth and reconciliation, some sense of trying to reconnect the country. And you've had 3 successive elections, democratic transitions without disruption in some military form or the other. I mean, with all of the unfinished business in South Africa, give yourself credit for having 3 democratic elections in transition. You just had a very successful World Cup, which was a major statement to the whole world, because these events have a way of illuminating a given situation. I mean, there is unfinished business, to be sure, because now you have freedom, but not equality, and that becomes the next stage of our struggle. We are free, but not equal. We've ended the kind of race-based apartheid. We have to have a passbook. We've ended the kind of, can you vote, you can vote. But you can have the non-racial skin color apartheid over. You can have the right to vote, and then still have your equal share of shipping and banking and trading and mining and real economic infrastructure.
Moving beyond the work that you'd be doing in South Africa right now, I mean, you've worn many hats and been participated in a lot of global peace efforts from Kosovo to Northern Ireland, but you've also been a special advisor to the Clinton administration on democracy issues in Africa. How do you rate Africa today? Because a lot of Africans are grappling with that political change that you're referring to, and at the same time grappling with this economic justice that we all need.
Well, there are 26 to 30 African countries that are now having elections, and that is a step in the right direction. South Africa has set the pace. As big as Nigeria is, it likewise is having, you know, democratic transitions in elections. And so we know that open, free, fair democracies bring the best out of people. It also attracts world investment and relations. You're not likely to invest in chaos, or you're not likely to invest in unstable administration. So the political stability lends itself to attracting economic investment. I'm convinced now, however, we cannot just settle for projects. We must now settle for plans. The U.S. and Britain tends to offer to Africa aid. China's offering investment, which is very different. They're offering grants and aid, conditional. China's building railroads and ports. That's what I mean by the Marshall Plan. That was not a grant, that was the U.S. and the World Bank saw its interest in rebuilding roads, bridges, ports for transportation, so that when that happens, you in fact can grow. And I'm convinced that now is the time to, and Marshall Plan was 50-year loans at 2% government secured. It was because they knew they had a long-term interest in European stability, and so we left with Europe NATO, left with them defense, we offer them favorite nations, trade status, and the infrastructure. Well, Africa not only deserves no less, but it is mutually beneficial for the participating nations.
Let's talk about this African Marshall Plan that you've proposed in recent years. I mean, how would the plan be sponsored and run? Because African governments would respond to you right now and say, we're committed to infrastructure investment. We're embarking on public-private partnerships with the private sector. We are committed to this thing.
You really need a combination of the World Bank and participating nations. Nations that benefit from African trade ought to be a part of the investment in its own growth. And the World Bank has a role to play in that. I'm convinced that an issue has to be the issue of transparency and an independent judiciary. So when there are problems, it does not depend upon local governments which may stifle the process. If there is an assurance that the money will be well spent and that it will go to roads and bridges and sewers, and it will go to airports and seaports, and if there are conflicts as an independent judiciary, not politically stacked, that gives an assurance that's needed in order to bring about the kind of investment that's needed.
You use the word assurance, and I'm going to transcribe accountability as well. When you spoke at the Karama conference in Nigeria, yourself and a lot of your counterparts speaking there lamented the lack of accountability in Africa. An example was raised that over $380 billion had been embezzled from Nigeria, which is one of the largest crude oil producers in the world, and oil revenues have just left Nigeria because of corruption, and people have lamented this fact, but not focusing on corruption. I just want to know what's your sense of African leaders today and their sense of accountability.
The whole continent, for that matter, you must have transparency in handling of monies. The continent is too rich to be so poor. Got wealth of soil, the most endowed continent, the biggest continent. You can put the US, Europe, and China and Africa and have land space left. And why is China and Japan eyeing Africa? Because Africa has the raw material base they need to sustain their economic growth. So Africa is this wealthy continent and all these poor people. That cycle must be broken. And that's why I use this word accountability, or transparency, and international independent judiciaries. When people, like in the case of the Marshall Plan, it was an independent thrust, but no country could dominate the process. And I would say that today, if Africa gets its fair share of ports, seaports, airports, roads, bridges, you're then going to have more movement of people, trade, and growth.
Well, Lumkile, your views on this one, I know you concur on this issue of leaders being more accountable, being more innovative, investing in infrastructure. It seems as though we all know what the problem is. Why can't we just get to the solution?
Well, in fact, I was very interested to hear Rev Jackson about exactly that issue around African leadership, because I'll argue that globally there is dearth of leadership. And what Africa should be doing, particularly at this moment when we're seeing huge capital inflows into emerging markets, including Africa, and given the problems that we've highlighted of well endowment in terms of resources, but very short in terms of addressing the problems of the poor and unemployment.
Look at how the world responds to Nigeria under the President Sirleaf's leadership. An integrous, credible woman who attract capital because there's confidence in the government. And again, I want to applaud this government for having democratic transitions that were not coups, that did not divide the country along lines of race or tribe, so to speak. And that's a step in the right direction. But that must happen everywhere. Of course, we should have checks and balances. But this is not just an African phenomenon. Why do we have the American great economic collapse? Because of lack of accountability. Banks were not accountable. The Congress did not do oversight. The banks were greedy. The result is you had this run on the housing market. They were not accountable. The result is you now have these banks are moving toward a global depression. President Mubarak had to bail out the banks to salvage the global economy. I mean, the Northern Trust in London was one of the first banks to fall because of lack of accountability. So checks and balances and accountability must apply not just to Africa, but everywhere.
Let's move over to the United States. You mentioned President Obama and the spotlight really on the United States after the midterm elections, the rise of the Tea Party and a sort of a radical discourse about the economy in America. How do you feel about this move back to a conservative base, not just in Congress?
It's not just the Tea Party. The Tea Party is the tip. It's like an arrow. They are the arrowhead. There's the shaft where the power is. I mean, there is the bow, and there is the string. There's the whole shift toward what? Ignoring what got us in the crisis and sowing seeds of unfounded fear. One does not call, for example, Social Security Roosevelt care. One does not call Medicaid and Medicare Johnson care. Yet the health bill is called Obamacare in the pejorative sense. Yeah. We have 59 million Americans who have no health insurance, in part driven by 30 million Americans who have no job. And so to care for women and men who have cancer, for example, they're not covered with pre-existing conditions. That's a good thing. Students come out of school guaranteed debt without a guaranteed job. they can stay on their parents' insurance till they're 26. That's a good thing. Yeah, but he's around the attacks. So you got Obamacare, which attacks health care. He was not born in America, which is not true. He's not a Christian. He's a Muslim. He's not one of us. Take our country back. You have a combination of the unprecedented attacks, very personal attacks that diminishes and discredit. On the other hand, so you have these unfounded attacks, but you have real economic fears. The unemployment is unacceptably high. But he inherited that. His policies did not create that. He inherited, we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. He stopped that hemorrhage. Then the bank bailout, which the money got paid back, by the way, saved us from a global economic depression. I wish it had been linked to lending and reinvestment, not just bailout. Then you had the impact of the stimulus, which saved 3 million jobs and created 3 million more. Not enough, but all these are steps out of a very deep hole. I think most Americans underestimate just how deep that hole was. If he had not bailed out those banks, we have no idea what the global depression. You look at the marches in France, the marches in Britain.
Those may be the facts, but the sentiment at the moment doesn't seem to support the facts. And there is a sense that President Obama needs to get a better handle on the economy, especially jobs, because, you know, that's a bread and butter issue. If you lose your home, if you lose your job, you lose your pension, you've literally lost everything.
I think that's a step in the right direction, no question. And that's why he just took this tour. We're going to trade agreement. But you cannot ignore yesterday. So let's start today. Things don't start today. There is a yesterday, a day, and a tomorrow. And when Republicans say, well, we're going to cut huge tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. If the 2% cut remains, that's $1 trillion debt for 10 years. That's a deeper hole. If you have less regulation on these banks, then you'll have more reckless behavior by the banks. If you keep having wars of choice, like going into Iraq and Afghanistan, between the wars of choice in Afghanistan and Iraq, $1 trillion. Between the huge tax cuts by the wealthiest Americans on the one hand, and then the reckless behavior banks, that drove us into a hole. He inherited that. Now, I'm convinced that now is the time for the banks to start lending and start reinvesting. They got bailed out. Detroit, for example, 90,000 homes in foreclosure. I mean, closed homes, abandoned lots. If that's a plan to do what? To do landscaping and rebuild houses with move down boards and pull up window panes and painting and glazing. You can put America back to work, but I think it's unfair for him to have taken the attack hits he's taken and no appreciation of the whole he inherited.
Yeah. One of the things that Bush did very well, is not popular in South Africa, as you might be aware. One of the things that he did very well was his support of ARVs to South Africans when the southern government was not committed to really delivering to the mass of our people. And Obama regime, the first thing they did, one of the things they did was to cut some of that benefit. What's been your assessment of those benefits that the Bush administration, particularly to South Africa, now have been cut by the Obama regime?
More comprehensive African policy and Haiti policy. You know, and Haiti hit the crisis with the hurricane. 7 big nations had a big, broad press conference on bailout Haiti, and those countries have not honored their the donations yet. For example, you now have the rains and these racket tents, and now you have the cholera. More than 1,000 people have died. And you have no visible face of leadership, and Haiti is in our hemisphere. So we need a more aggressive policy to deal with the poor, wherever they are. But Africa means so much to America and the world. We cannot stand by begrudgingly giving grants and aid while China's building railroads and bridges and sewers and building relationships based upon investment, not just based upon paltry aid.